Thank you for joining us for the 5th Annual Global Summit on Kidney Innovation. If not us, who? And if not now, when? A collaboration partnership event presented by the American Association of Kidney Patients and George Washington University School of Medicine and Health Science. My name is Gail Glasser, and I'm an AAKP Ambassador and a kidney transplant recipient. When I was 15 years old, I came down with a strep throat, but there was no indication that I was sick or there was a larger issue at hand. After a few months, my body began to swell, and that's when my parents took me to the doctor. At first, the doctor didn't even think to look at my kidneys to see whether they were damaged. However, within a year, I started gaining a lot of weight. The doctor was made arrangements for me to go to Mayo Clinic in Minnesota, and it was there I had my first kidney biopsy. I was diagnosed with glomerulonephritis. Back in Chicago, I started seeing a nephrologist who was a bit unconventional, but he truly was like a guardian angel. And because of his protocol that he put me on, from the age of 15 to the age of 60, I lived with my glomerulonephritis and never went on dialysis. He kept my kidneys healthy. He did it by teaching me how to properly care for my kidney and my whole body. 11 years before my transplant, right before he retired, he let me know he put me on the transplant list at Northwestern Memorial Hospital. He said by the time I needed a new kidney, I would be number 1 on the list. He was right. In fact, there was a period of time that I was on top of the list and my kidneys were functioning at a level that was still adequate. But eventually the time came when I needed the transplant. On November 20th, 2015, I received a call saying that they had a kidney for me. I didn't even have time to think. All I asked was it a good kidney? And the answer was yes. I met my second guardian angel, Dr. John Friedwald. He's a post-transplant nephrologist and a researcher out of Northwestern Memorial Hospital. I have been blessed that he has been watching me over me since 2015. Receiving a transplant was a blessing, and since the moment I entered the hospital in 2015, I've been constantly looking for new ways to protect my new kidney. Being part of AAKP since 2016 has allowed me access to the education and resources I needed to improve the quality of my life as a patient and a platform to use my voice and my experiences in a meaningful way to demand more innovation, more choices for myself, others diagnosed with kidney disease, as well as those yet to come. I am so pleased to be part of this important global event. In 2019, AAKP announced 2 major initiatives, AAKP Global and Decade of the Kidney. AAKP is engaged internationally because we are committed to educating patients and leaders across the globe on the importance of disease prevention, new innovation, in treatment and the necessity to improve more lives. We believe that a united patient voice can drive more intelligent alignment of the policy, regulatory and payment decisions necessary to bring new safe innovation and patient without undue waiting and needless interference. Across the globe, AAKP is working with patients, medical professionals, researchers, and medical industry allies to address the many unmet needs of the global kidney community. AAKP believes the international collaboration can help close the gap in U.S. and in countries where healthcare systems and/or infrastructures do not fully support patient consumer choice or immediate access to new treatments. It is my honor to moderate our session titled, unintentional impacts of government regulation and reimbursement policies. This panel is specifically designed to educate patients and allies on real examples of policies, regulatory, and payment issues that are concerned to the advancement of both current and future innovation. As you have heard throughout the day today, patients have the most to lose or the most to gain when decisions are made in their name. But without making our voices heard, too often our best interests are not fully served or represented. This is particularly true of the issue our first speaker will raise regarding the future of transplant drugs, development, and the need for new therapies that extend the life of the transplant organ while minimizing side effects. Again, we have an incredible panel of speakers for you this afternoon. Each of these issues is critical to be aware, and we're pleased that they have joined us here today, including one speaker joining from Sweden. As we move through the panel, I will be introducing each speaker individually as I welcome them up to present. First, we have Dr. Meier-Kriesche, Chief Scientist Officer of Veloxis, correct? Pharmaceuticals. Dr. Meier-Kriesche is a board-certified nephrologist with over 20 years of practical clinical experience in transplantation and authored over 100 scientific publications that have appeared in numerous peer-reviewed journals. Additionally, Dr. Kriesche is a committee member of the Transplant Therapeutics Consortium, an entity co-founded by the American Society of Transplantation and the American Society of Transplant Surgeons that foster consensus and data-driven research to speed the development of new transplant medicine. Please welcome to the podium Dr. Meier-Kriesche.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's a great pleasure and honor to be invited to speak to you this afternoon. Certainly, we have learned that the regulatory pathways which we aspirationally would like to change in transplantation, it is really important to involve the patient voice in order to make that happen, and that's for many reasons. To the intent of the session, certainly the regulatory pathway, which has been the same for the last 30 years in transplantation, is a good example of potentially unintended consequences. First and foremost, for patients, we are measuring with our current endpoints in transplantation one-year outcomes. And while that may have been relevant 30 years ago, nowadays, fortunately, most of the patients with the transplant, be that kidney, heart, lung, they are surviving the first year after transplantation. What really matters is quality of life and long-term survival. But what is measured by the endpoints, which we are measuring in clinical trials, is just whether a patient survives 1 year. So the focus is developing new drugs which have an impact on 1 year, while the community really wants to focus on long-term outcomes. What is really important to adequately define the unmet need in order to get to the regulators? And again, this needs to be happening through the patient voice. We clearly know that long-term survival in kidney transplantation or also in the other transplanted organs is not where it's supposed to be. Long-term survival has really not changed over the decades. We have made improvements in short-term survival, and that's because we have measured that and we have targeted that. But long-term survival hasn't changed. Now, you may ask why. Well, there are plenty of reasons, but some of them are very glaring, and those are really the drug regimens we are using in transplantation, which are highly toxic to many different organs. They cause diabetes, cardiovascular disease, renal disease, Yes, you heard right, renal disease, the same kidneys we are transplanting, we are actually impacting with the immunosuppressive regimens we are using. Now, we have to move past that, but we can move past that only once we have more efficacious medications. The other component of this is when a medication regimen is not tolerable, patients will ultimately not take the medications. Non-adherence is a huge issue in transplantation. As you can imagine, that also impacts on long-term outcomes. That's in a nutshell where the unmet need is. This could be a 1-hour talk, but let's leave it at that. And let's look a little bit more at what we could potentially change in immunosuppression. So as the endpoints in transplantation, also our immunosuppressive regimens are close to 30 years old. We have been using small molecule with broad intracellular effects with plenty of on-target and off-target toxicities. Fairly recently, some of you may have heard in the news a fellow patient of yours, Amy Silverstein, who's a 2-time heart transplant recipient. She was recently here quoted in an opinion piece in the New York Times. She was also on a national news channel, has written a couple of books about her experience. And she's really squarely pointing her finger at the lack of innovation in immunosuppression development in transplantation, and really also the role the regulators are playing in this. So this is our fledgling pipeline in transplantation. If you think about the past, many large companies, Roche, Novartis, Astellas, Bristol Myers Squibb are invested in transplantation. They all left the space. We have now a few companies which have early phase 1 and phase 2 assets. It's going to take a better part of a decade to get these assets to clinical use, but really the focus needs to be on protecting these assets and incentivizing more companies to come into the space. So how do we do this? And this is really the most important part of my talk, this slide. The current endpoint we are using in kidney transplantation is a composite endpoint of death, graft loss, acute rejection, or loss to follow-up. That means we are valuing equally whether a patient in a trial is simply lost to follow-up or maybe had a rejection which were treatable, or the patient actually died or had a graft loss. These are all equal events, and they are measured at 1 year after transplantation, and that gives you the approval for your drug. What we need to do is we need to move towards endpoints which can predict long-term outcome, so that the focus of drug development is on improving the long term, and that can measure how patients are feeling and how they are functioning through patient-reported outcomes. So that's really where we would like to go. About 5 years ago, the transplant societies have founded the Transplant Consortium, which is a public-private partnership under the auspices of CPATH, which has taken it on to develop a new reasonably likely surrogate endpoint for transplantation, an endpoint which can measure long-term outcomes. How we have done it, we have brought in data from past clinical trials and from large databases in academic medical centers. We have built the largest transplant repository in history of transplantation. And with that, we have validated an endpoint, which is a composite of renal function, donor-specific antibodies, proteinuria, and biopsy scores at a year after transplantation, which is actually highly correlated to long-term outcomes. And we have had a great partnership with EMA, within the space of about a year, the EMA has been able to qualify this endpoint, which is now currently available, to be used in a conditional approval in kidney transplantation in Europe. Here in the US, the regulatory pathway has been a lot longer. We have started with this a lot earlier. We actually started with conversations at the FDA in 2018 with a symposium. And since we have gone through the biomarker qualification program, which is sanctioned through the 21st Century Cures Act, and with the timelines we are looking currently at, if we are indeed successful, and again, this is a big if, where we need a lot of help from patients to explain to the FDA that we need to take this risk and we need to drive towards new endpoints. But if we are successful, this may become qualified in 2025. So big difference about the speed and apparently the urgency the regulators have in Europe, where within a year we had this qualified, as opposed to here in the US, we are looking at a 5-year process. Again, there could be really a dramatic need for educating the regulators on the urgency in transplantation and preserving the pipeline, and more importantly, trying to drive innovation in the future, which is badly needed. Thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Dr. Meier-Kriesche, for that wonderful presentation. I personally thank you very much for educating me. As an AAKP Ambassador, I had no idea, so thank you. Next, I'm pleased to welcome Dr. John Friedman, Chief Medical Officer of Eurofins Transplant Genomics, a transplant rejection diagnostic company committing to improving organ transplant outcome worldwide. He has more than 30 years experience delivering innovation health solutions for a variety of stakeholders, including patients with complex medical conditions, healthcare providers, and payers. Dr. Friedman is also a fellow of the American Society of Transplantation and received an ASTM Distinguished Service Award. Please come up.
I'm really delighted to be here speaking at a conference on innovation. I think, as Ulf mentioned previously, the 2022 OPTN kidney report, the second sentence said there has been no significant innovation in the last 20 years to improve kidney allograft survival. I had that discussion with a prominent nephrologist in Denver a couple weeks ago, and he says, "John, you're wrong. It's 40 years. So my conflict is I'm an industry, but as many of you know, I am an advocate for patients, and I think a staunch advocate. In my prior life at Optum, as was kind of mentioned by Gail, I was co-founder of the United Health Group HERO program, helping employees receive organs, which then got the United Health Group to be the founding partner of the AST Corporate Circle of Excellence, which reimburses for lost wages in addition to travel and lodging for living donors. And the Corporate Circle of Excellence now umbrellas about 2 million people in North America. So I think I have the right to speak on behalf of patients, even though I'm with industry. So I'm here today to talk about policy, reimbursement policy, and specifically a MolDX policy that was released about 3 months ago. MolDX is a program that was developed in 2011 to identify and establish coverage of and reimbursement for molecular diagnostics, ergo MolDX, molecular diagnostics. It's administered by a company called Palmetto GBA out of Florida, and the medical directors are all actually working for Palmetto. The original LCD that covered molecular diagnostics went into effect in June of 2021. And under the original LCD, tests would be covered when the following conditions were met, And you know what? That print is so small, I can't even read it. But maybe I'll just kind of turn around. So you have to be suspicious of an acute rejection episode or want to know the status of cellular or antibody-mediated rejection. And I could spend the next 6 hours talking about how molecular biomarkers do that, but I think we're going to take a very high-level view of that in a couple of slides. The other things that need to have occurred is to assist a test to assist the adequacy of immunosuppression. You've given somebody a kidney, you put them on tacrolimus, you put them on MMF. Is that adequate? Is it too much? Is it too little? Is there subclinical rejection going on? To rule out for acute rejection in validated populations with a clinical suspicion of rejection. And for if you have had what they call a clinical pretest, which is your serum creatinine goes up, you develop proteinuria, you develop new donor-specific antibodies, or if you have an inconclusive biopsy. Fine and dandy, it's an LCD. He who has the gold writes the rules. And since MolDX is the payer, MolDX gets to write the rules. They came out with a billing article in March the 3rd that was to go into effect March 31st, and you think, well, gee, that's really quick. But under the laws, and a local care determination does not require a period of public input. Only an NCD, which is a national coverage determination that would be issued by Medicare. But they kind of changed it, and there's some clarifications, and it will now actually go into effect on June 30th, which I believe is Friday. And the Z codes are actually the billing codes that one bills under, so no matter what test you have, you're going to have 2 Z codes. And there are 2 different kinds of uses for biomarkers. One is for surveillance, and the other is for cause. Surveillance is monitoring a stable population over time, and you're looking for the earliest possible detection of subclinical rejection. It is clear, beyond any reasonable doubt, that this billing article was done for cost containment. With trying not to be too nasty or point too many fingers, there are companies out there that were using biomarkers probably inappropriately. You cannot use a non-specific donor-derived cell-free DNA test for surveillance. Surveillance, as I described, basically means you have a stable population and you're looking for something. You can't do a test that is now, it is now only going to be covered for cause and should have been covered just for cause to do surveillance. And when you're doing the test every 2 to 4 weeks at approximately $2,800, it ran up a lot of cost. There's a simple way to have corrected this rather than rewriting rules. It would have been to cut the cost of the cell-free DNA from $2,800 to about $500. And quite frankly, I would have lived with that one too. Per MolDX, the billing article was simply a clarification of the original LCD, but what they really did was rewrite the rules. So from the billing article, these are quotes. For any given patient encounter, only one molecular test can be used to assess an allograft at a time. Now, this kind of sounds good, but as I'm going to show you shortly, sometimes 2 really is better than 1. And this not only impacts transplant genomics, but there's another company out there called Thermo Fisher that has a test called molecular microscope that was looking to use both biopsy and gene expression at the same time. That test is now done. If a biopsy performed and the biopsy cannot be performed, you have to have a period of time between the 2 tests. The problem with that is a lot of the validation studies were done on these tests simultaneously, and there's no data out there that we could clearly validates when the tests are done, not concurrently. What does this do? It squashes innovation. What am I really happy about? Being at a conference on innovation. And I do believe that some of these tests really are the innovation that could change long-term graft survival. MolDX states there's been inconclusive data that the early diagnosis of subclinical rejection prolongs graft function. They're right. I'm not going to dispute that. However, I didn't know that was going to go that way. I thought it was just one slide. So given a test that we had, which was both a gene expression and a cell-free DNA, we called it Omnigraph instead of TrueGraph and Track together. It's clear that the two tests are better than one in that you cannot tell when you have a rejection episode whether you have subclinical acute cellular rejection, which is in the green, or subclinical antibody-mediated rejection, which is in the blue. And if you have, and gene expression picks up the ACR better, cell-free DNA picks up the AMR better, and if you do them together and both were positive, there was an 89% positive predictive value in this paper by Dr. Park from Northwestern in October of 2020. The difference being she used microarray. We reran the data, which was all from CTOT 14 on microarray PCR and got 89% positive predictive value for a double positive and a 94% negative predictive value for a double negative, and 2 probably really was better than 1. And the other thing that this test does is it doesn't allow the clinician to use his or her brain to decide what's best for you, the patients. This is kind of, you're being told, I can't use this test anymore, even though we think this test validated it nicely. MolDX decided they really didn't like the study. Another thing that was in the language of the billing article is that the use of the molecular test for surveillance testing is only compliant with the policy if the patient is enrolled in a center that utilizes the practice and would otherwise receive a surveillance protocol biopsy. Only 20% of the centers in the United States actually use surveillance protocol biopsy, leaving 80% of the centers potentially out of the ability to use a molecular diagnostic test. I think that is severely limiting access to only large urban transplant centers that utilize the protocol biopsies, and it is limiting the access to rural and community nephrologists who care for the vast majority of the post-transplant patients in this country. And it's discriminating against these rural and underserved minority populations. Why did HRSA attack UNOS? One of the key reasons was they didn't feel that UNOS did a good enough job getting access to transplants to rural and underserved populations. So this limiting the access to the urban centers, in my opinion, is in direct counter to what the HRSA has been trying to do for transplantation. So who are the biggest losers? It's always the patients. And it's just wrong. And I think we've heard several times today that inability to progress innovation puts us back in the dark ages. The dark ages to me is what was described. You have biopsies, which are invasive, expensive, and with potential long-term complications, including graft loss. And you would go back to serum creatinine or proteinuria. It goes back to there's been no significant innovation in the last 20 or 40 years to prolong kidney allograft survival. If someone loses the graft prematurely, by the time your serum creatinine goes up, you've lost 30 to 50% of your nephrons. And I make jokes with my hepatologist friends that they pick the easy organ because the liver regenerates. The kidneys don't regenerate. That dead nephron is a dead nephron. And if you lose your graft prematurely, you're going to go back on the transplant list. And when you get a second transplant, that means somebody didn't get there first. We've got to do a better job of obtaining the goal of one transplant for life. And I believe that this policy has an unintended consequence of putting a big hold on that. And with that, I thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Friedman. Our next panelist is right here in Washington, D.C. area. Mr. Engel Burns serves as the Senior Director of Government Affairs for Thank you. Aurinia Pharmaceuticals, and is charged with leading the company's legislative and policy portfolio, ensuring that the patient's community has access to new and novel innovation in kidney care and management. It is my pleasure to welcome Mr. Burns to the podium, and I'm turning everything over to you.
Thank you, Gail. And thank you to the American Association of Kidney Patients, and all of you are here today. I am very aware that I am one of the last speakers, and I'm standing between you and your evening break and whatever beverage you may want to partake in. So I will try to keep this as brief as I possibly can. Let me tell you a little bit about Aurinia. Aurinia is a company that is, I'm going to have to do the same, I can't read this print either, exists to transform lives by delivering therapeutics and change the course of autoimmune disease. We have a drug in the autoimmune space that treats lupus nephritis. And it has been a profound pleasure for me to join this company. I joined this company about 3 years ago, and understanding the patient journey, and understanding the unmet medical need in this space. There was about a 50-year gap of new drugs to treat lupus, and we were one of two that were introduced in 2020 and 2021 that were both introduced within about a month to treat lupus nephritis. So very proud to join this company, being on the kind of front line of innovation. We launched our first, again, U.S. FDA-approved drug, oral therapy for lupus nephritis called LUPKYNIS in January 2021. And our commercial hub is here right outside of D.C. in Rockville, but our global headquarters is in Canada. So what do you need to know about lupus nephritis? Lupus nephritis is patients who suffer from systemic lupus oftentimes will develop lupus nephritis. About 45% of the patients who suffer from systemic lupus will eventually have kidney involvement in their lupus diagnosis. It's 2 to 3 times more likely to affect African American, Hispanic, Latino, Asian American, Native American, Alaskan Native, Native Hawaiian, or other Pacific Islanders, and 9 out of 10 people who get this disease are women. On average, it takes about 6 years to be diagnosed. It's a very protracted diagnostic process. Where a patient is going back to their general practitioner and back over numerous visits with different symptoms, and they finally narrow it down, and on average it takes about 6 years to be diagnosed. 1 in 3 SLE patients suffer from multiple autoimmune diseases, so that makes the diagnostic pathway even that more complicated. Systemic lupus can affect all of the, or many of the organs in the body, and the diagram here kind of points out where you can see systemic lupus attacking a person. But in this case, with lupus nephritis, we're talking about the renal functioning and how lupus, when it attacks the kidneys, the kind of damage that occurs. LN occurs into about 45% of adults with lupus, and the progression can result in cumulative and irreversible damage of the kidneys. And compared to SLE patients who develop lupus nephritis have 45 times greater risk of kidney failure, 3 times greater risk of death. LN patients face 6 times higher mortality rates than the general population. So it is a devastating disease. In order to understand who is most at risk for it, you really need to look at the demographics, and the demographics are obviously minority women, and understanding that, and then understanding the diagnostic issues in the diagnostic pathway, it can be really challenging to make sure that these women get the care that they need. And as we launched this drug, we found that out as we've been going through this process. Again, 45% of the adults who have SLE will have a chance of developing lupus nephritis. Patients with LN are more likely to be female, and then LN disproportionately affects women of color. I'm going to move forward a little bit in order to save a little time here. The key in treating lupus nephritis is to make sure that these patients receive prompt and effective treatment. When a patient is suffering from lupus nephritis and the lupus is beginning to attack the kidneys, oftentimes those patients won't know it. They won't feel anything. There won't be symptoms involved in this process. So it is important for that patient to make sure that they're being regularly tested and to make sure that they are screened for lupus nephritis so that an intervention can happen sooner versus later to save kidney function. The guidelines to support decreasing proteinuria to reduce kidney damage are seen here, and many of you, I'm sure, know about the idea of making sure proteinuria are at the right levels for these patients suffering from kidney disease. The economic burden of lupus nephritis, if it's left unchecked, it ends and oftentimes goes and progresses to end-stage renal disease. And if you can get that lupus nephritis under control on the front end, you can save money to the healthcare system overall on the back end. So we're talking a lot about, we're going to talk a little bit about the policy issues that affect patients who are suffering from lupus nephritis, and that is my specialty. I'm the government affairs lead at Aurinia, and when I was hired into this company, I was asked by our leadership team to make sure that the patients who needed the therapy could get access to the therapy. It is not, and I asked the questions, why aren't there more companies doing or bringing drugs to market in lupus? One, it's the size of the patient population. It's a very small patient population, and secondarily, very difficult to do the clinical trials because it's such a limited patient population that you can choose from to enter into these clinical trials, and then getting the drug to market. All of these hurdles compound themselves, if you will, in getting these drugs to market. But one of the other things that we were concerned about was are insurers going to pay or reimburse for the drug? Oftentimes, if you want to know what drives a company into making a decision to bring a drug to market, it starts with the science, but there also has to be a viable pathway for that drug to be accessed by the patient who needs the drug. Negative impact. So one of the major hurdles that we faced when I first got here was a step therapy regimen. Before 2020, December 2020, there was not a drug indicated to treat lupus nephritis. So in December 2020, one drug was approved. In January, the next month, within 30 days, our drug was approved, and yet and still, both of those drugs have to deal with step therapies that says a patient has to fail on a drug before you can get access to these newer drugs. The irony of that is we were the only two drugs indicated specifically by the FDA to treat this disorder. So to have steps through what most payers call the standard of care is somewhat ironic because those standard of care, even though they've been used for many years, are not indicated specifically for that, for treatment of the disease. But in this case, we wanted to make sure that the patient, when they got to the physician, they were able to access the drug. We wanted the physician to be able to make the decision on what drug works best for the patient, and we worked very hard to rally advocacy organizations such as this organization, and making sure that we're speaking to patients and physicians, to speak to the insurers to ensure that, hey, when a physician decides to put a patient on a drug or put a patient on a therapy, and they both have decided between the physician and the patient that this is the best course of action for this particular disease, the doctor's voice needs to be heard. So we work hard at making sure we're elevating that physician's voice. And step therapy reform has been one of the main ways policymakers are giving more weight back to the physicians and taking some of the power away from the payers to say that, hey, in this case, no, I'm not going to send my patient through a step of something that they may have been on before and failed, or something that I just don't think will work. I'm going to let my patient use the drug that I want them to start on, the drug that I want them to start on. It is particularly important in this type of disease state, a degenerative disease that if there is a failure, you would have lost kidney function that you won't regain. So the sooner you get the patient on the right therapy, the sooner that patient is compliant with that therapy, the better outcomes you will receive. States, again, have recognized this, and policymakers are recognizing this, and states are passing independent laws limiting the effect of step therapies by payers. They're saying to payers, we want to shift some of the more of the decision-making power back to the physician, back to the patient, and they believe that some of the payers may be overutilizing these utilization management tools. The tools were granted to these payers by policymakers, and I think one of the unintended consequences of granting them those powers, they granted them those powers to use these management tools like step therapy, like prior authorizations, first to make sure that the patient was receiving the correct medication based on scientific standards. Secondarily, they used it to help curb costs to the system. A lot of it was designed when they first originated or gave these payers these tools. The idea was we want to make sure that if there's a brand drug and a generic drug, they're chemically equal. We don't want the system paying for a ton of brand drugs. Let's move people toward the generics. But in this case, in these more complicated diseases, where you have more targeted therapies or more unique therapies, and drugs are not as interchangeable as they have always been, especially with biologics. When now you have biologics that are that you can use that are similar to the original biologics, but in a lot of spaces and places, their use of these management tools has caused some issues for patients getting access to these therapies. Policymakers are realizing that, and they're beginning to pass laws. One of the challenges with the state laws only apply to the insurance policies that are localized within the state. If you have an insurance policy that goes across state lines, that is an ERISA plan or a federally protected plan, then the state laws won't affect how that plan works within that state. So at any given time, in these states that have passed these step therapy reform laws, about 50% of the plans within that state are subject to those laws, and the payers have limited powers to use the step therapy management tools, but the other 50% of the plans within that state are generally federally protected plans that don't have to abide by those state laws. But the good news is Congress has realized that, and Congress has a bill circulating currently as we speak that will kind of close that loophole. It is a federal law that will grant physicians more power in deciding what therapy they want their patients to take. Another issue that has been bubbling up policy-wise that has been a little bit challenging for patients is a policy called copay accumulators and maximizers. Basically, when these newer generation drugs or specialty drugs treating these rare diseases can be costly because of the amount of research it takes to get these drugs to market, the difficulties in the clinical trial process, and just the sheer number of patients being so low. These medications, if you're going to get them to market, can be costly. And cost sharing has been a problem. The original cost-sharing laws that were on the books, in a very similar way as we talked about the generic brand rationale earlier, is the same rationale that applies for copays. In other words, if I have a branded Tylenol and I want you to use a generic version of it, I can charge you a little bit more on the copay here, or percentage of the cost of the drug here, to make you incentivized to use the cheaper generic version of Tylenol. And those laws were fine, but now drugs are much more, some drugs, especially in these rare disease spaces, can be more expensive, and having a 5% copay or cost sharing on a drug like that costs thousands of dollars versus a drug that costs a few dollars, you could see it could be cost prohibitive for patients to get access to the drug. Industry and policymakers have understood that, and they've allowed workarounds, if you will, so copay assistance programs and things of that nature to help patients get through some of the cost hurdles that may be in front of them that may keep them from access. The challenge has been, payers are now saying that if you receive copay assistance from some third-party source or from a manufacturer, we are no longer counting that against your deductible. So at the end of when the copay assistance runs out, then you're left with a patient who has a huge deductible to stay on therapy or to initiate a new therapy, and it becomes cost prohibitive. So states, again, are taking action here, and also the federal government has a plan also, or a legislation that is circulating to address this issue as well. And I'm going to just mention this briefly, and I'm going to end it here, even though I have a few more slides, because it looks like I'm running out of time. But health equity is a huge hot button topic here in DC and in policy circles, both at the state and federal level. There is a huge push to make sure that all patients have equal access to the therapies and the physicians and the services that they need to ensure good health outcomes. But clearly there are some reasons why some patients are doing better than others. And what we found, at least at Aurinia, at the launch of this medication, is that a lot of the patients that we serve have issues that are causing poor health outcomes. If they can't get transportation to the physician, if they can't get time off work to make sure that they make their appointments, or to get their lab tests, or if they've had child care issues, or they had issues with nutrition, or a lack of mental health services, all of these things, are encompassed within the social determinants of health. And what we found is that some of those patients, when they're facing these kind of environmental pressures, have difficulty maintaining their therapy, especially when you're sick and you're not feeling well. It's hard to find ways to overcome some of these hurdles. And that is a good space and place where all of our collective voices can make a difference, especially when you're engaging policymakers. They like to hear about these kinds of problems. President Biden just announced that he's doing a broadband, he wants to make a corner-to-corner broadband program within the United States. I was on a telehealth call with a physician and a member of Congress yesterday, and they said that having telehealth accessible technology so that a physician can actually speak to their patients without the patients having to travel into the office, having those virtual visits adds a lot to healthcare outcomes in a positive way. So the more of our voices collectively speaking to policymakers, trying to lower the hurdles of access for these patients, I think the better these patients, and I'm sure the better these patients will be, and I'm sure the better all of us will be. So thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Burns, for sharing the impact Aurinia Pharmaceutical is having on kidney disease space, helping patients manage the many complex comorbidity conditions they often face. At this time, I'd like to introduce you to Mr. Matthew Shaulis. He is the U.S. President, Chief Commercial Officer at Hansa Biopharma, which is an enzyme technology company focused on rare immunological conditions. Mr. Shaulis is more than 20 years of U.S. and international experience in the biopharmaceutical industry and is helping to bring imlifidase, if I say it wrong, a medication for desensitization of highly sensitized adults needing kidney transplantation to the U.S. Please see the monitor.
Hey, thank you, Gail, and everyone. We really appreciate this opportunity to join the meeting. I'm joining from southern Sweden tonight, so please forgive the dark background. I'm certainly sympathetic that you're reaching the end of your day. There's been a lot of talk about transplantation today, and I'd like to reflect on that a little bit further, and specifically that the unmet need and disease burden in end-stage renal disease is real, and that kidney transplantation affords survival and quality of life benefits over remaining on dialysis, and there are still some underserved patient populations that are worthy of greater focus. The numbers tell a really clear story. 13 people die each day in the US waiting for a transplant. Almost 140,000 Americans are waiting for a kidney transplant. 40,000 were added to the wait list in 2021, and about 120,000 Americans annually begin dialysis. We've seen an increase in overall organ transplantation in the last 10 years or more due to the advancement of immunosuppression and transplant techniques. However, disparities in access to transplant, they persist for some populations. And one prime example of that are highly sensitized patients. And while a better understanding of subsets of patients has resulted in more individualized strategies to improve outcomes among these marginalized and vulnerable populations, the proportion of highly sensitized patients, those with a CPRA greater than 98% that are receiving a transplant, have increased after the 2014 KAS revisions took place. They went up to 12.5%. But since that time, they've actually decreased back down to 6% today. So let's double click on the kidney allocation system. It includes things like waiting time, age, transplant history, distance, and quality of donor kidney, KDPI. Revisions provided additional points to the highly sensitized patients, and those revisions led to changes that were indeed progress, and that included increased transplantation of those highly sensitized patients. But despite this, there were risks with donor-specific antibodies and other factors that have remained an impediment for greater transplantation with these highly sensitized patients. Across the U.S., the wait lists are estimated to include over 3,000 patients with a CPRA between 98% and 99.9, and about 2,000 patients with a CPRA above 99.9. So it's clear that we've got somewhere in the ballpark of over 4,000 sensitized candidates that are on the waiting list. They represent a community of disadvantaged patients who would benefit from progressive therapies and interventions that could facilitate these incompatible transplants. Though it's associated with higher risk, these interventions nevertheless could be more attractive than remaining on dialysis with the associated accumulation of mortality risk that happens over time, something that I think has been discussed earlier today. And importantly, within these big numbers, there are communities and patient subgroups that continue to be overlooked. Secondly, given that dialysis costs are about $120,000 a year in the US, transplantation not only provides improved survival and quality of life, but it also saves public and private payers substantial resources that can get deployed to other patients and other unmet needs. So these are some pretty clear challenges for patients and even to some extent for payers. What are the solutions? Well, there are several areas where we see some opportunity for strong integration, engagement, and modernization of approaches that will ultimately benefit patients and deliver better outcomes. Let me just touch on 4 of them real quickly. First, policy is the starting point for innovation, but execution is also key. Historically, our system of care for end-stage renal disease in the US is nearly completely designed around dialysis. It's a great example of how the American healthcare system, in many cases, is focused on paying for procedures rather than for outcomes. But some have articulated a newer vision. The Advancing American Kidney Health Initiative 2019 represents one of the bigger steps forward in U.S. kidney care since the end-stage renal disease program began in 1973. It does this by addressing how kidney disease is prevented, diagnosed, and treated, ultimately a much more holistic approach than simply focusing on procedures. Moreover, public-private partnerships are envisioned to further spur disruptive innovation that we hope will result in better treatments for these patients. Second, better reimbursement coverage options for dialysis patients are very much needed. New patient models from the Advancing American Kidney Health Initiative are intended to give healthcare providers better incentives to reorient the system away from that focus on dialysis, including the delivery of more life-saving transplants. As of January 2023, kidney transplant recipients will qualify for lifetime Medicare coverage of their immunosuppressive drugs if they don't have other insurance. And before this time frame, people who were eligible for Medicare because of end-stage kidney failure, rather than something like age or disability, lost coverage for those immunosuppressive medications 36 months post-transplant. So many patients struggle to pay for these drugs, leading to rationing or stopping taking the medicines entirely, either of which greatly increase the risk of the transplant failing and the patient returning to dialysis. Many others did not even try to get a transplant for fear of not being able to afford their immunosuppressive drugs after that 36-month time frame arrived. Similarly, dialysis patients face significant out-of-pocket cost-sharing liability, and they may seek to enroll in Medicare Advantage plans because such plans generally offer reduced cost sharing and are required to offer a maximum out-of-pocket limit on annual spending. Many of us are familiar with the 21st Century Cures Act, and one feature of this is that it permits dialysis beneficiaries to enroll in these Medicare Advantage plans. As a result of the statutory change, enrollment of dialysis beneficiaries in Medicare Advantage plans spiked pretty significantly between December 20 and January of 21. It went from 27% to 36%, and by December of 21, the share of dialysis beneficiaries enrolled in those Medicare Advantage plans exceeded 40%, really underscoring the need that those patients had. Third, approaches to organ allocation can better ensure access and equity for all patients. Proposals that mandate one-size-fits-all approaches to a complex set of clinical problems could result in creating more barriers to transplantation, particularly in certain difficult to transplant or subsets of kidney transplant patients, like those who require desensitization. It's therefore critical to address the discard rate of 25% and climbing, as we're on track to discard over 7,000 kidneys this year alone. There's also some measure of inequity to transplantation access when we look at gender. In most countries, organs are transplanted into men, about 65% into men in 57 countries. And naturally, there are some medical reasons that explain this, but there's nonetheless a significant opportunity for a more equitable balance. Lastly, regulatory bodies and pathways haven't really evolved to keep pace with innovation in transplantation, and the patient voice is also missing from these early discussions. We've started to see this in Europe, where the regulatory authorities are willing to consider that patient voice in the assessment of benefits that might outweigh risks in order to bring innovation forward under quicker conditional approvals. It's a more fluid, modernized approach, and it recognizes the advances being made through science, even in the face of limited clinical experience, which can subsequently be gained in post-marketing requirements. Our work with AAKP on a patient preference study will give voice to patients for consideration in their clinical conversations. The study will investigate the factors that highly sensitized patients most value when making a choice to remain on dialysis or proceed with an HLA-incompatible deceased donor kidney transplant surgery. The goal is to ensure the patient voice is heard and understood during this clinical decision-making process, particularly regarding the decision around transplantation or, as I said before, dialysis. So in closing, at Hansa, we know this community is working hard every day to find ways to help more patients faster, and we're looking forward to being a bigger part of that. I think we all recognize in our own ways that policy is important, but it's less impactful without great implementation. And likewise, innovation is critical, but it's less meaningful for patients without the regulatory frameworks to enable trials and evidence generation. For some perspective, the last innovative approach to transplantation was over a decade ago with belatacept. I guess you could make an argument that it's been 40 years, as we heard from some earlier speakers. But I think it's pretty clear that we've got to work together now to drive greater innovation. Doing that is one of the main reasons why we remain committed to doing what we can to partner with other stakeholders and, of course, increase opportunities for all patients that are awaiting kidney transplants. Thanks a bunch. Really appreciate you accommodating me at this late hour, and very much looking forward to our next speaker.
Thank you, Mr. Shaulis, for the great presentation. Greatly appreciate it. Our final panelist is Ms. Tammy Gilon, CEO and co-founder of Laminate Medical Technology. Ms. Gilon began her career as a medical device engineer before co-founding Laminate Medical to help surgeons make better functioning fistulas. She leads much of the company's engineering and design efforts and has built a diverse global team to hopefully bring Laminate Medical flagship product, Veloxis, to market around the world. Please come up.
I thank AAKP for the opportunity to present VASCU here today. My name is Tammy Gilon. I'm the CEO and co-founder of Laminate Medical Technologies. Laminate has developed the VASCU device, which is implanted in arteriovenous fistula procedures. Arteriovenous fistula procedures are the gold standard for vascular access for patients on hemodialysis. It's a very simple surgery that is done in the arm. Suturing between a vein and an artery, it can be placed in several anatomical locations along the arm to allow arterial outflow to be filtered outside in the dialysis machine, and then the filtered blood is returned to the venous system after being filtered through the dialysis machine. So a few data points to learn about arteriovenous fistulas to give you some context to these surgeries. This is the most common vascular access for patients. So worldwide, there are more than 3 million patients that are on hemodialysis through an arteriovenous fistula. We're talking about a procedure with very high failure rates, 60% failure rates within the first year after the procedure. These failures mean that these patients has to go back and back to the hospital, as you know much better than I do. And this is what we're dealing with and we're trying to address at Laminate. Again, over the first year, we see very high numbers of failures that reach 60% after a year. These failures means that these fistulas has to be fixed again and again at the hospital, reintervened and repaired in order to allow hemodialysis for patients. So what are the root causes for these failures? We're talking about several factors of failures. First of all, there is a very high wall tension that is created on the vein when blood is flowing from the artery to the arterial, from the arterial system to the venous system. There is a very problematic geometrical configuration which is created after the surgery because nothing holds the configuration in place. And the third problem is a flow problem that is created between the artery and the vein when arterial blood flows to the venous system. With the VASCU device, which is a nitinol device that is placed as a scaffold outside of the vein and artery connection in the arm, we actually mitigate and address these root causes that lead to the failures. So first of all, it provides structural reinforcement against the high wall tension that is developing on the vein. It puts the device right in place in terms of the geometrical configuration to allow for better flows over time, and it retains the geometrical configuration permanently. This is a permanent implant that stays in the body. Let me show you how this is incorporated into the surgical procedure, into the standard fistula procedure. So this is the device again. It contains of two parts, the braid and the brace. There are several anatomical locations in the arm where the device can be placed. The surgeon will dissect the vein in order to suture it to the artery. The device is then threaded over the vein. The suturing is done between the vein and the artery in the normal fashion routine, and right afterwards, the vascular device will be deployed on the junction area between the vein and the artery. The skin will be closed, and over time, this will be promoting better remodeling of the vein and preventing the collapsion of the vein over the artery. The cannulation is done routinely through the vein. So what is the actual benefit for patients? We've been learning a lot over the past decade with this technology, and what you see here is a summary of several clinical trials that have been either ran by physicians or sponsored by the company. We're talking about randomized control studies, registries, and single-arm trials. On the right, in the blue bars, you can see the numbers, the consistent results that we've been seeing for usability of these fistulas over time, compared to the red bars in the left that represent the largest prospective studies that have been done in this medical discipline. You can see how significant the difference is between those two bars. Again, in blue, you see the laminate fistulas with the vascular device. And these are among many territories like the UK, Israel, Germany, Italy, Spain, France, and the US at the very right. Specifically, when we looked at apples-to-apples comparison, we had two studies with control groups. Two of them were physician-driven independent studies in Italy and in Germany that were published right after. And the third one was a sponsored study by the company. Across the board in all studies, you can see that in terms of the usability and the functionality of these fistulas, the advantage to the vascular group was significant. In the US, we ran a pivotal trial, a single-arm trial, and that was enrolling 144 patients across the country. We've been working with the most reputable centers around the country, and the results were actually phenomenal. So in terms of the safety profile, there were 0 safety events that were associated with the device, so very clean safety profile. And I would like to share with you a couple of outcomes today that has the most major effect on patients. The first outcome is the reduced intervention rate that we've been seeing. This number means that we were able to reduce by around 50% the need and the necessity for reinterventions for these patients to save the fistula and keep it patent. It means that fewer patients had to go back to the hospital to undergo additional procedures, and this obviously translates to savings to the system as well. Another metric that was significant for patients was higher usability rates, as was presented in the other slide as well. And this means that patients with the vascular device had fewer catheter days, fewer CVC removals, which means that the risk profile of these patients was much better, because it's a consensus, as you all know, that fistulas perform much better than CVCs in terms of risk profile, additional complications that it carries. So just to summarize, with the CE mark that we've obtained in 2016 for Europe and other countries in Asia, some countries have already started the adoption of the technology. Countries like Germany, Italy, France, the UK, and Spain have been starting to use the device consistently. There are a few countries in the pipeline, like Taiwan and Singapore, South Africa, and Australia as well. The future in the US, however, remains questions. And the reason is that when you deliver new technologies and innovations for patients in the US, there are several stakeholders that have to be aligned, and we need their buy-in for this. Obviously, the first one is the inventor of the technology. In this case, Laminate is the company that invented the vascular device. We've been investing the past decade in developing and researching this technology. The second buy-in, which was significant, was from you, AAKP, the patients, which are the most important stakeholders for this technology. And the other layer was the surgeons that are actually using these devices. So VASA, which is the Vascular Access Society here in the US, and the SVS Society, which is the Society of Vascular Surgeons, all are supporting across the board in approving and bringing to market this technology in the US. After 7 years of interactions and a long dialogue with FDA that started in 2016, unfortunately, in March earlier this year, we got a denial from FDA for this technology to the US. This was very confusing and surprising for us. And we will put more and more pressure on FDA to make sure that they are accurately assessing this opportunity for patients here in the US. Because when we look at the, again, risk-benefit profile, this is how they should assess new technologies, we see a very clean and safe safety profile for these patients. And in terms of benefit, there is a lot of benefit that has been presented already, starting from being a breakthrough designation status, which by definition means that there is a large unmet need. This is a low to moderate risk device. We've presented US pivotal trial results, a propensity score matching to CMS Medicare claims that show a significant advantage to our data, another retrospective chart that was asked from FDA, a UK randomized control trial, and a lot of real-world evidence that has been presented to you today. So I will just end with a question. With such buy-in from patients and doctors, I'm asking myself, who is FDA actually serving with denying innovation? Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Gilon, for sharing the exciting work that's being done at Laminate Medical.